My name is Jennifer Wang, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in New York State. I'm also first generation, half Korean, half Egyptian.
Some people have already watched the first video, and we're kind of continuing this conversation about mental health and what that looks like, especially from the angle of being mixed Korean. And today's topic, we decided it would be on forgiveness, dealing with traumas from growing up and learning to understand why your parents did what they did. This happens to all kids, I imagine, as you grow up, the things that you didn't understand from your parents when you were younger and maybe
Absolutely.
resented. And then as you get older, you start to understand more from their point of view. But I think when it comes to mixed homes, or especially if you've got two languages going on, or you're not able to communicate fluently, for example, or you just have two very different cultural upbringings versus, say, your mom who grew up in Korea and then you who grew up in the States, there can be a lot of miscommunication that happens. And I feel like that resentment can grow and be really hard to untangle over time. I also think that some lines can be crossed so far that it's really hard to kind of come back and resolve things. What do we mean when we say trauma?
The textbook version of trauma is having an emotional response to an event. It's actually like a reflexive response that our body does as a way to kind of keep us safe. I don't know if you've heard the expression little trauma or big trauma, like little t, big T, but that also can like depict on the different types of trauma someone experiences and the impact it has on them on a large scale or a smaller scale. So, what I think is trauma for me and my body might not be the same for you and your body.
But I listened to this podcast where they were talking about the grandfather diet, and they were saying the food that your grandfather ate affects you physically today and your own growth and all of this. Trauma also has a physical effect, and it can be passed down physically through the generations, but I didn't quite understand what they meant by that. And I think some people might even wonder if that's true or not.
So fascinating around like generational trauma, how that can be passed on. And this can vary from the stories our parents or our grandparents tell us to even like the social cues or the unspoken messages you're getting in within your family. And so when we think of the physical carry of trauma, that can be some tension you had, that could be high blood pressure, that could be diabetes, it could be on the scale of a actual chronic illness, even to the part of around a mental illness.
So I feel like a lot of times, if we're talking specifically about in the US or in the UK, we talk about the model minority, right? This image of doing well in what this Western society is demanding of you. While simultaneously, I feel like a lot of people who are coming from immigrant and Asian families are dealing with this generational trauma at the same time and not being able to speak about it openly or be able to share it openly. And I imagine that's just a huge burden on a lot of people without even realizing it.
I can think of like, from my experience of Korean, is there's grief. And that can also be a depiction of trauma, of the Korean War, of the divide of North and South. It's like this energy that gets carried on to the next generation. With that can come a lot of shame and guilt. And so it's almost like the unacknowledged trauma is what gets processed and passed down to later generations. Sometimes as we get older, we can kind of pinpoint that. Other times we, feel like we're carrying our parents' shame and guilt in a way and not recognizing that it's not ours that we're carrying, it's our families and their families. But without acknowledging it, we continue to pass that down. I can share from my own personal experience, like, my dad, again, born in a village outside of Seoul, he went through that. In our relationship throughout the years, I remember feeling this sense of like pressure and the shame and guilt. And I felt like it was passed on to me from my dad. And so I remember in 2018, when I went to Korea and we went to the DMZ and we saw, I just remember feeling so much sadness and feeling the grief. And very much it was triggering for my dad, but we were able to be in this moment together. And I think that was really powerful and for me, very healing. Like, I feel like I was able to, with the acknowledgement of knowing this and sitting with the discomfort, at some point I was able to let go of that and then let go of me and my dad's dynamic. And we were able to see each other in a very different light. And part of that is that forgiveness piece. Because of me and him with our language barrier, I don't know if we could sit down and have a conversation about, like, you know, back in my day, this happened and oh my God, you know, that just wasn't going to be the case. So I think when we talk about the forgiveness and generational trauma, I think there has to also be a sense of understanding and, like, not compromise, but like realization of what's going to be able to work for you, even though it might not be ideal, of like having a sit down conversation, because that's just something that, you know, we're not able to do, and that's okay.
There's a lot of people who don't have the opportunity to learn their parents' language. What might be a different method?
I think maybe one can be curiosity, whether you can start with asking questions and kind of see what goes from there. For me, one way I could get an insight to my dad's world was he loves telling stories. Granted, sometimes they might not make sense, but like they were still really cool to hear because he had really vivid memories of his, you know, home. Me and him being able to be comfortable sitting in a space together where there wasn't communication, it was just in the presence of him going through his emotional response. But I think in order to get to all of that, you first have to do your own self-work around processing how you feel and maybe the impact of the trauma on you and or your own trauma with your parents or caregivers before you can even do that, right? Because you need to make space for that, just that acceptance and openness. And, you know, when we talk about, you said a lot of resentment, we hold on to that resentment and anger, I always associate that with pain. So there's a lot of pain that you still haven't been able to heal from.
Is it necessary to understand the root of that trauma, to understand why they happened in order to move past it?
Well, I don't know. I think it can depend, because I think in some cases you might not be able to have that opportunity as to the why, whether it's purely like, you know, that kind of tangible evidence isn't available. And we see that a lot in regards to adoption around like the sense of belonging and acceptance. That's like two really prevalent themes when it comes to adoption. You might not be able to find out your why. So it's more of, again, focusing on self, of how can you work through this to feel more confident and grounded in you. We all seek safety, trust, power and control, intimacy, and esteem. And a lot of those like necessities for individuality, I think we can do that without having to find the why, because, you know, you're not going to help me fill my void. I'm going to help fill my own void.
But when we say forgiveness, when we're talking about traumas, what do we mean?
Being able to heal and move forward. Keep it short and simple. That's what, to me, forgiveness means. Being able to have growth, being able to process, and again, being able to heal.
Perhaps the first step is forgiving yourself for not being able to get over something, or forgiving yourself for blaming somebody else for causing you trauma.
I would say maybe the first step is just acknowledging that, you know, you have this angst within you, and then giving yourself room to actually process it versus trying to either compartmentalize it. That's sitting with the discomfort. Like in my grad program, we used to say sitting in the shit. Being able to learn to kind of sit in it, but not be consumed by it. And that can be really, really hard to do, because I think we like to think that either it's buried away or that we maybe have worked through it, and yet ironically it's still lingering there.
Why is that important though? Why is forgiveness even important? Can't you just live your whole life bearing this grudge?
No, because I think there would be actual physical effects on that, right? Like physically, emotionally, and mentally. You could have that tension, like high blood pressure. You could have, you know, diabetes. You could develop, again, chronic illnesses because you're holding on to this tension and your body. And when your body holds on to this, like if you were to be tense all the time, that does have an impact on you physically, mentally, emotionally. It could be forgiving yourself for maybe holding on to this as long as you needed to. And I think that's the thing, is wanting to hold on to that anger can be fuel, it's the drive that keeps going. Yet ironically, I think of it as a really heavy backpack with a shit ton of bricks. And that's heavy. That's so heavy. And it's so much energy and emotion you're putting into something else versus self. And maybe that means that relationship you have with that person no longer is there. And it can be coming to a place of understanding that parent, that caregiver tried to do the best they could. I don't know, if we didn't reframe that, then we would say all parents are terrible, and that's not the case. I think a lot of times parents try to do the best they can with the circumstances. And when we have immigrant parents trying to navigate 2 or 3 different worlds, that's tough for them to do. If we're not able to get to that place of forgiveness of ourselves and forgiveness of that person, then again, we're just continuing to drag that resentment, which then can become a generational trauma that you pass on then to your next kid.
When we address, let's say, Koreans who have the Korean culture and the Korean upbringing and the Korean traditional way of expressing or holding things back, and then we have these, mental health issues or emotional stressors, trying to address those from a Western point of view, I think it can easily get misconstrued as a mental illness, or as something is just wrong with you, or all you need to do is take such and such medications. Because I feel like the lens through which Western psychologists might be viewing this issue that this Korean person is having, it's not through the same lens, it's not through the proper lens. And I think that's another thing that's very off-putting for Koreans who are living in Western countries, and why they're not getting help when they are dealing with these traumas.
Yeah, I think you speak to a part around like being culturally competent in the mental health field. That's a big reason why I got into it for myself, was because of having a little bit of understanding, if not full understanding, of how mental health and illness can present for someone who is not of Western culture.
So kind of bringing it back to family then here. Obviously, family is complicated and relationships are complicated. And sometimes when you break trust, or when you cross lines, or you say things that you wish you hadn't said, how are you able to forgive yourself?
Now, I say this is a blanket statement, but I think it's really important to show yourself some self-compassion and acknowledging and accepting the pain you were in when you did or said whatever you did. Keep in mind, and I want to be super clear, that doesn't excuse what you did or said. What it does is give you more complexity of a person. You're not one-dimensional, right? We have layers. When you're able to show yourself some self-love and compassion, that's again acknowledging it, being able to accept it, and then hopefully being able to release it. But I really think in that we are our own worst critics. So, we don't show ourselves that compassion and love, especially I think in Korean cultures. And so I think it's really important to highlight that, because I think when we sit in the place of I should have and could have done better, then we're going to be stuck in that loop. And again, more anger and resentment and frustration just continue to build, versus making space for, acceptance, forgiveness, healing.
It is still a long ways to go, and it's no doubt that our generation still feels this inability to communicate with our parents a lot of times, this inability to express our real emotions. So hiding behind the excuse of saying, well, it's just Korean culture, that's just how my mom is because she's Korean, I don't think that's an excuse for bearing your traumas. and not speaking about it openly.
So we could put that analogy to some terrible historical events and say that's just how it was. And that totally dismisses the part around being able to be a changing agent or being able to work towards healing. We have a lot of resilience, every one of us, and a lot of power internally. I think it's just us being able to harvest it. And that might be, maybe you do speak up, or maybe if you feel like you're not able to, maybe then you start to do the journaling. There's ways where you can practice communication with self and with others. And this might be a little bit of my tough love that I sometimes like to drop. Healing isn't dependent on others, it's dependent on you. Again, like I said in the beginning, acknowledgement is so powerful for all of us because we all want to be seen and heard. And I think sometimes when we feel like those fractured relationships with our parents, specifically our Korean parents, it can be because they don't acknowledge or hear us. And that might not ever change, right? So then again, it comes back to us and me doing the work. And when I come to releasing it and forgiving myself and for even forgiving them, I can still decide I'm not going to have a relationship with them, or I can decide I'm going to keep distance. Some more tangible ways in working on forgiveness: uncovering the anger and accepting and acknowledging that, making a decision too to forgive. That is something that's really important when it comes to forgiveness. Is it's a conscious decision you decide to make. Doesn't dismiss what they said or did to you. It just means you understand that, again, they're not one-dimensional, or even yourself isn't one-dimensional. And then the final piece is releasing the harmful emotions and reflecting. Again, that can be journaling, that could be moving your body, that could be even meditating, or even creating a sense of community within maybe some peers or other family members.
And I also want to say, for people who are watching this, thank you for being here, for just clicking this video and maybe asking that question: do I need to work through my own traumas? Do I have traumas? Am I able to forgive myself? Am I able to forgive my family? Because first, being able to recognize it in yourself and be willing to at least start addressing that is a really huge step. And I feel like it's also very brave, because it can feel like you're doing it by yourself.
To people that are listening, please know that you're not alone in this. I've had my experience, Becky's had hers, and I think it's just kind of like a work in progress, but there is a community of support.
We're going to continue this series. We're going to have a couple more topics that we'll be discussing. So Jen will be around. And if you have any questions or topics that you guys are interested in hearing about, you can leave it in the comments below, or you can email us at thehalfieproject@gmail.com.